Well, thank you very much to each of you on the panel for your thoughtful inputs. I hope we can put together a synthesis of your comments and put it into a form that will be advisory to us and to others as well. So we thank you for your insights. So now we have a substantial time for questions. This panel went on a little bit longer than planned, and that's consistent with our overall plan because we don't need quite as much time at the end as we've budgeted. So we're still very nicely on schedule. So let's consider starting with questions that are related to the presentation made by Dr. Srinivasan in the afternoon session. Yes, please.
Yeah. Again, Brian Bruns. I think it was a very interesting presentation and would like to follow up. We talked during the break. If you could maybe talk a little bit the potential for this model as it is or further developed to understand, given you're saying there are areas that will run into scarcity, to understand the options for managing scarcity, working on recharge, changing the crop mix, and in order to detect those problems and monitor, can the model itself help, or what needs to be thought about of, in a sense, the argument would seem to be setting up well monitoring should be a basic part of any intervention, at least in places where there's a risk of depletion. So what kind of well monitoring would be important to detect problems and inform management, and how could your model help?
Thank you. So we are dealing with constraint analysis, basically, what you're talking about. So if there is not enough water, because the analysis, what I presented, is mostly based on the groundwater resource availability. So if there is not enough groundwater resource available for a particular cropping system or particular irrigation technology or for a particular lifting technology and stuff like that, actually. So one can run through these models with different combination of these technologies to see what might fit to make it sustainable, actually. Within that, then we talked about resilience, actually. Suppose what happened if you had 2 years of drought? Will you have enough water in the ground, for example? So those are the kind of analysis one has to do, things like crop insurance, for example, or add additional security measures or additional measures to make sure it will be resilient enough to cover that, actually. If for any reason that's not available, then we also need to look at other supply of water, such as the surface water. Okay, so one has to look at holistically all the options available in order for you to make a proper recommendation and whatnot, actually. So, but the model is quite capable of handling it. It depends on what kind of questions and who's going to use that information and how you want to get that information across, actually. So that's what it's going to dictate.
What kind of well monitoring would be?
I mean, the well monitoring is mainly before and after rainy season, actually. Okay, so if you talk about that, actually after rainy season, how much of recharge is happening, and then after the dry season, how much is depleting, for example. So you need about twice a year is all you need the monitoring to get a better handle on what the depletion rate is going to be. Yes.
Mike?
Thank you. One comment.
It's Mike Dockery.
Mike Dockery. One comment, two questions. On your map, the irrigation area for potential, we talked about this during the break. There should be really a line following the black and white volta, because it's almost not, it's not used at all during the dry season, and it has huge potential for pumping, and particularly solar pumping, because you only have about a 5-meter lift in a lot of places. Two questions. You showed yield differentials between rainy season and dry season. What about valuation? Eggplant, okra, bitterball, et cetera, particularly peppers, have a huge difference in value between major cropping seasons and dry cropping. And then what about valuations of small value-added processing, the difference between fresh peppers and dried chili? You can add 30 to 40%. Have you done that? And the second question is particularly around adoption. And I'm very interested in the risk and the environment in which that enhances and enables adoption. those three countries you're using, Gates recently did an analysis of improved seed adoption. In Ethiopia, it's 3 years. In Tanzania, your other country, it's 7. In Ghana, and Ben will probably know this, it's 15 plus years. Their major maize crop is Obatampa, a variety that's over 30 years old. And they have far less effective extension system. Do you look at, does that impact at all that probability of adoption at all, the environment in which it's done?
Thank you. I hope I can recall all the questions. But I think the main thing that you talked about on what's the first question? I forgot.
First question was on the value.
Yeah. Okay. So we did evaluate the various cropping systems, actually, both the wet and dry season cropping system of about 10 different vegetables, 2 different fodder, and but we did not have a value added in terms of dry chilies versus red chilies, for example, actually. So that's not something we have added in explicitly in our model, but that could be potentially on a value chain model that we are considering in the next iteration, would able to consider those processed food, for example, actually. So taking it from supply to the, from the farm to the kitchen table, for example. So that's something we need to be thinking about it as we move along on this. As far as the economic outcome, actually, yes, we do have our economic analysis where we did consider the price differential. For example, if you have brinjal versus okra versus onion, how that's going to be. It also includes some of the shelf life, because onion may be kept a little bit longer, whereas tomato or others may need to be used more immediately and whatnot, actually. So we did use some of those depreciation and cost and things of that nature to cover the economic valuation. The last point about adoption thing, actually. Currently in our adoption model, we have only the resource constraint adoption, actually, the optimization model. We don't have the policy fully implemented yet, actually. So that's something we can think about, like you're talking about seed or improved varieties or improved implementation of some of this stuff because of the government efficiency and stuff like that is not completely integrated in the model yet.
So Randy, is it also true, though, that if one chooses to do so, you can assume a range of adoption rates? One can say like a 10% adoption rate and a 40% adoption rate, and bracket what the possibilities are, and that kind of information, I believe, is going to be useful to downstream investors. Tim.
Dr. Srinivasan, I think you did a fantastic job. Given the duration, the duration of the work you've done, it's quite impressive. But I'm really very concerned about some of the results you showed. And boils down to how you validated your models, the different components. You didn't explain that, because one concluding remark is that water resources is freely available in Ethiopia, and that's not a problem. But we do know that that's not really the situation. So it boils down to what indicators did you use to assess the environmental impact of small-scale irrigation? That's the first question. The second question is, given the presentations by Ifpri, Nicole, and Co this morning, I was expecting in the model for the ex-post analysis to see some of the effects of adopting small-scale irrigation on nutrition of the adopters, on the household, stunting and things like that. Is there a follow-up work that is going to come? Because that is actually what most decision makers are interested in. What has been the impact of what has been adopted?
I'll take the second question first, actually. That is, in our current model, we don't have the things like the complete nutrition model, actually. All we have is the availability of nutrients for the household family, like whether it's a fat or calcium or micronutrients and things like that, actually, based on what they produce or what they're able to buy off the market shelf and things like that, actually. We did not go into the extent of the stunting or any of the growth aspects on that kind of stuff in our current model, actually. So that's something we need to look into, a totally different kind of nutrition model if you're going to grow the kids or the family over a period of time to see how they are going to grow and whatnot, actually. As far as the ex post analysis, we did use all the field data to calibrate or validate our models from what we found from the field data in all 3 countries. We need to expand from the field data to the national scale. We have to use the satellite-based information like evapotranspiration, for example, leaf area index, NDVI, and things of that nature, actually, to look at the large scale, how much. Because if you look at a hydrological budget, evapotranspiration is anywhere between 60 to 70% of your total budget, actually. So if you're able to predict your evapotranspiration from the cropping system properly, you are going to capture most of the hydrological process along with that, actually. How much of water is both in the river and in the stream and in the groundwater and so on and so forth, actually. So we use remotely sensed data mostly for our validation at the large scale. I did not have the time to show that. In fact, I had another about 20 more slides behind that the thing where I stopped, actually. But we did have those results, and we are publishing them, and those will be in peer-reviewed publication fairly soon.
One other point that I believe is relevant there, Tim, is that you remember that the household studies are comprised of baseline and inline studies. And a lot of what you heard today was the baseline study results. And yet there'll be quite a bit more, particularly from other countries than Ethiopia, coming on the inline studies on the ILSSI part of this. The other thing is to say that we have a companion project, a collaborative project with the Sustainable Intensification Lab that has increased the depth of analysis on the human nutrition side. And that's being done by the Innovation Laboratory on Nutrition at Tufts University. So there's a fairly substantial amount of information that is going to have to be synthesized over the period of the next 9 to 10 months. Moffett.
I guess this is not a Srini specific question, it's more general, I guess, to the ILSSI team. First of all, thank you so much for all the information you've shared. One of the things that was somewhat touched on, but not at great length, and certainly not something that was in the original scope within ILSSI, but one that I think will be important going forward is a question relating to enhancing and expanding sources of nutrients and protein, specifically, and micronutrients, particularly from animal source foods and so on. So we heard quite a bit about fodder and expanding livestock, but fisheries and aquaculture is a thing that sort of could be somewhat in there when you think of what's possible with aquaponics or maybe small dams and may support certain aquaculture practices. We've seen some of that in Bangladesh and Cambodia, for instance. But do you guys think that that's going to be an important avenue for delivering on nutrition? What are some possibilities there? What do you sort of envision as being useful things to think about for us as we try to work on the global food security strategy objectives?
Wants to take that? Okay. I mean, being in Asia, I know how the system works there, actually. But bringing that type of technology to Africa, you definitely need totally a cultural change. If you want to bring in all this fish productions and aquaculture and stuff like that, people have to be first trained on that, actually. People have to know the value of that stuff. And then you need a lot more surface water than the groundwater. You can't just rely on groundwater for most of your aquaculture production. So we got to be carefully, I mean, it's definitely possible, like in the Volta region probably, where you have a lot of surface water. Maybe you can divert some of the water for aquaculture production and so on and so forth. But definitely it's possible, but it's a matter of getting a stakeholder input to see how many of them are willing to go in that direction. And also there is a lot of capital investment on that, actually. So we need, if you're talking about a capital investment on irrigation, you're talking about substantial investment when you're trying to grow like tilapia or any of the specialized fish products, actually, as a part of your aquaculture production system, actually. So the technical know-how is much more higher than doing traditional agriculture with irrigation as an added component, actually. So that's my personal immediate response to that. But anyone else want to take additional stuff on that? Nicole? Okay. I guess I'll leave it there, actually.
Are there other questions about Dr. Srinivasan's afternoon session? We had questions this morning about the first two presentations. We have some time now if you want to ask any more general questions about the project in general, or go back to any of the discussions that we had this morning. We have a bit of time to do that. Dr. Saadida?
Yeah, I'm Sadito from the University for Development Studies in Tamale, Ghana. I just wanted to talk a little about this controversy between manual and motorized pumps. I don't think the whole idea is about this or that. It all depends on the constraints around and the scale, actually, of what's happening. I mean, we've seen the kickstarts being very well used in Mali, in most parts of the around the Segui area. At least we've been there. We've seen so many people using it, and it's quite efficient. But that should not necessarily apply to other places where they decide that they'll use the motorized pump. So I don't think it is either or. It all depends on the kinds of constraints that people are having in terms of finance, in terms of even the land use and so on. The other area that I wanted to actually talk about is economies of scale. We always forget that economies of scale is just not going from small to large, but even at the other end, the large scale, you can begin to get decrease just because it's too large. So it all has to do with an optimum scale. And with the kinds of constraints that we are getting more and more, you will probably be surprised that very small scale production can be more efficient, more optimal than just increasing because of economies of scale. So economies of scale is not as, especially with the kinds of more constraints that we are getting every day. Small scale tends to be more even efficient these days, even in maize production. We are beginning to see that very large farms, in Ghana in particular, is far less efficient than small scale production, even in rain-fed. I just wanted to mention that so that we don't assume that as long as you are increasing, it means there is economies of scale. It's not that clear. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh.
I don't know that this isn't exactly a question, so pardon me, but I just wanted to come in on that point about the small versus large scale, and in part response to this the point that Ben raised about the public-private partnership study. We have been looking at that. That has been focusing more on large-scale systems. And one of the things that I think is very important is that the economies of scale, when we saw those pictures of the center pivot irrigation systems this morning, those were on flat land. And when you get very heterogeneous environments, I think some of us were on a previous field trip in Zambia where the costs of clearing the land to put in center pivot were thousands of dollars per acre. And they hadn't factored that in. The private sector investors. Now that was Zambia, that wasn't part of our study. But I think this issue of fitting the environment is really important. And that also links back to the issue of land tenure. Because the smaller it is, the more you're able to go with the existing landholders. The larger it is, the more likely you are that you're going to have to move people around. And the land tenure issues also become much more complex. So I think that's that's another factor. It doesn't fit neatly into models unless you can actually put that in realistic terms in the costs. But there's a social cost to that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I just wanted to give a small experience of Tanzania, especially the coexistence of large-scale farmers and small-scale farmers. And actually in Tanzania, what we have developed is a policy of coexistence. And as Prof. was saying, actually the production on the small-scale farmers in one of our schemes in Tanzania, in Morogoro, actually the small-scale farmers are producing more than the large-scale farmers. Actually, the large-scale farmer is producing about 5 tons per hectare for paddy, but the small-scale farmer have gone up to 10. So what I was saying is that on the policy issues, as Ben was saying, maybe we put that coexistence, which are actually have proven to be very, very helpful, and then the large-scale farmers are helping the small-scale farmers across the whole value chain. So I just thought maybe that can be shared. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? DeWitt?
I just have a quick question, just so to push the idea that, I mean, this is mainly for private sector, so that I understand some things. So, for instance, the way I see any private sector development is, if you are a private sector, then you have to do 3 things, I think. One is obviously knowing the customer, or knowing the customer, what they want and how much they are willing to pay. So in this regard, can you please explain to me what forbids someone who wants to go into private sector investment in irrigation from investing on these 3 areas of knowing the customer, what they want, and how much they are willing to pay? Thanks.
Question to somebody in the private side? Who wants to take on that? I think some of our private people already left, looks like, actually. So they are not here unless... do you want to take this?
Well, I'd like to hear the question rephrased because I was quickly sending an email, sorry. Please rephrase the question.
Okay. I was just trying to see, for instance, in private sector development, one of the problems is, new products have been, I mean, the cost of introducing new products is expensive. But specifically with irrigation, what are the challenges to really understand the customer, what they want, and what they are willing to pay from the private sector, and what can the research team can work to help that?
I think I can answer that very quickly. The real issue is making sure the private sector sell the product that the buyer needs, not the product that the private sector wants to sell. Where I've seen this connection break down, it's only on large schemes, I have to say. But as I explained during the panel session, I could quote a lot of examples in East Africa where the guy goes to the irrigation shop and buys the biggest machine the salesman can sell. That doesn't happen. So the crucial thing is actually educating the buyer, not the seller. And I think that there's a big, that's low-hanging fruit, actually, in terms of sustainability.
Oh, yes, exactly.
I just wanted to answer it from a different perspective, which is about how much private companies, so supply companies, are willing to invest in exploring markets, which is another way I interpret what you're asking. So, are those private companies willing to do, the market surveys and the willingness to pay surveys and things to understand it? And as from what I have seen, that investment is coming with the solar pumps. And in some cases, it's not it's companies and enterprises like IDE. Not necessarily, I'm not saying that IDE has done that for solar, but I mean those kinds of social enterprises where they have multiple sources of funding and multiple goals, they seem to be the ones that are investing in that type of market research and willingness to pay studies and trying to understand the market. And it's really with the solar pumps that I've been seeing that. Sorry.
Thank you. I will say there has to be also investment in training and data collection in smart. You have to invest in smart data collection as well. So there's a lot of training that is involved when you're pushing out a product, but in understanding the customer, that is where innovation comes in. That is where information systems, where research is used to share that data or to collect that data can be used by the private sector as well to educate them. So when you look at platforms such as probably people like IDE or anyone in the private sector who has worked with farmers for years, this data they have collected, you know? So how does the private sector work with each other? How do the seed companies work with the irrigation companies? How do you work with, for instance, the logistics companies so that that data can be shared? You know where the farmers are, what they need, what are the kind of conversations they have been having, and that is what we have been doing at MFARM. So we've been working with farmers and all these conversations that they are having. And you find that through data analysis, you're able to advise farm input companies on where to go, how to invest in the farmers, what are the kind of difficulties are they facing, how can they customize their products so that they can serve their needs. So there has to be a smart way to educate and to collect that data or to share information with the farmers or to share information from the farmers. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and following on from Nicole and Linda, we heard in my panel session that the cost of entering a market is quite an issue, and of course any private sector is going to pass those costs on to the buyer. But something like the DSS could do very precise market mapping that would significantly reduce some of those costs by telling growers what type of equipment there will be a market for just here and what type of market there will be for another type of equipment just there. And the other important thing that Nicole reminded me of is we're all getting very excited about solar. And there are good reasons for that. But everybody says, oh, but solar's so expensive. Well, not as expensive as you think. And in fact, the more players come into the sector, competition will drive the prices down. So that, to me, is a very exciting prospect.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi. I actually had a question for the last panel. I think, Ben, you made the comment at the very end that projects like ILSSI need to engage more with the end users. And as you heard, you know, ILSSI went through a long process of stakeholder engagement, has an advisory board in each country. There was a lot of capacity building that went on. And I was just wondering if the last panel or any members from the last panel might like to comment on what are some other steps that these kinds of research projects can take to make sure that the messages are really getting infiltrated into policy-making ministries in the countries, especially when you have projects that are addressing issues across different sectors like nutrition and agriculture. And so what are some other strategies or ways that we can be more effective in our messaging and communicating with people in the country? Okay.
Well, the fact is, and I'm sitting next to him, the fact is that our next step actually, and that's what we've actually planned it already, is to engage them in all the countries actually. It had been the next step, we've been planning it for some time. But the whole idea was if we could actually engage them even before this meeting, then definitely that would probably not have come up that. But again, I still agree that the more we engage with end users, with policymakers along the whole process, the better. But as I said, the ILSSI project has already planned that to actually engage with them at all levels, the district level, even at the national level, on all what we have done. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
And actually, from the project, we also have planned to do the showcasing. For example, for Tanzania, the project have involved from the local level up to the national level. And there have come a lot of positive attributes from that. So when we do the showcasing, actually that will be a way of publicity. And in Tanzania, actually we are working with other institutions who are also interested in these issues pertaining to efficient water utilization. So when we showcase, I think more information will be delivered, and even the replication and upscaling can be undertaken.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
We'll ask for any questions on the private sector panel and any afterthoughts from the African leaders, and then wrap up after that. So thank you, Srini. I believe we're ready for for Nicole Lefort to come, and she has indicated that she doesn't require 30 minutes to recant the afternoon, but I know that she's a lady of few words when it comes down to the end of the day, so she's going to do this in a shorter order. Do you want to get up there where you'll be a little more viewing for the external audiences?
See me unless I'm up here. So my job has gotten more difficult as I've gone through the day, right? I started with a presentation, then I was on a very difficult panel, and now I'm expected to summarize everything from today.
Thought you did that yesterday.
You know, I'm going to, bring in a little bit from the last couple of days as well, because one of the things that I think that we're reaching is kind of a convergence on some of the key messages across institutions and projects. And where I see some of that convergence over the last 3 days is about, the extent of the potential for smallholder irrigation. We, I think, are reaching this agreement that there's a tremendous potential there. And the questions then are arising, and there's similar questions about how to expand on that and how to reach that potential. I think that there's also convergence around the range of benefits. And we can look at it in terms of the food security strategy around resilience, livelihoods, nutrition, and health. So I think that there's some convergence around that small-scale irrigation definitely, there's pathways to achieve those benefits, and that's at large scale. But there's also a range of benefits incentives to farmers, and that's why we're seeing the farmer-led aspect of this. And related to that, it's about building on what already exists, right? We're looking at what farmers are doing, looking at existing successes, maybe sharing across regions about the successes, and building on also the existing information and knowledge that we have. It's clear that there's been research projects, and then there's been experiences from practitioners, and we're pulling those lessons together and having a much better understanding of what's happening and how we can improve on that. And also some convergence around the need to mitigate the risks of small-scale irrigation at multiple levels, whether that's at farm level or landscape level or regional level. And then from that, looking at the opportunities. And one of the things that I would like to do is focus much more on the opportunities and not as much on the constraints in summarizing this, because there is a tendency for us, particularly as researchers, to pick apart all the constraints. And that's important, but it's also important to us to remember that this is an important opportunity, and that there's a lot of benefit to be had by, from investing in small-scale irrigation. And one of those opportunities is these high potential value chains. So I liked this, it's food security and feed security. I think that that's a really strong message for, at least from today, if not from the last 3 days. And I would add seed. So I would add food, feed, and seed as value chains where there's high potential. And also, there are opportunities to mitigate these risks. So as we're, identifying the risks and mapping the risks and doing these constraint analysis, we're also at the same time, looking at those opportunities to mitigate those risks, whether that's on farm through practices and tools and technologies, whether it's better regulation, whether it's different forms of collective action. We are starting to, gain some knowledge and experience around mitigating those risks. And some of that may be, creating incentives for farmers, but it may also be enforcing some regulations and building the institutions to do that. But also recognizing heterogeneity and, this issue of, the landscape itself is not the same. It's not, homogeneous. The environmental aspects, the social aspects, and the actors. So this whole thing, which researchers particularly we fall into, right? It depends, right? So it depends on where it is. And one of the powers of not just looking at research at the farm level, but also bringing that into the modeling is being able to say, well, we can aggregate that it depends question and look at where to go and where not to go. So while we have some convergence and some key messages that are obviously emerging, we also recognize the need to do things differently, right? So in order to get to the kind of scale, in order to expand on that potential, and to scale sustainably, which I think is really important. It's not just about selling a lot more pumps or expanding a market, it's doing it in a sustainable way. And so that's sustainable intensification, but it's economic and environmental sustainability. So we want to achieve the inclusive benefits, empowerment, and not only reaching, which was another important message, was not just to reach people through pumps, but also to ensure some sort of inclusivity in the growth, shared benefit, and empowerment. So some of the messages today that I was hearing around that were about integrating across sectors and programs, but also taking that sort of farm systems approach. So again, it's integration, but it's integration at different levels. And I think another thing I've been hearing pretty clearly is about deploying knowledge differently. So yeah, we have this information, we have this knowledge that we're building, but how are we deploying that? Are we sharing it in the right ways? Is it reaching the right people? So we really have to think about how to be much smarter about where that information goes, how it gets there, and having better discussions about how we use that. And in some cases that might be where to invest, because that tends to be a big focus, but I think it's a clear message from Srini today is also about where not to invest. There are some places where it's better not to go there. And, if that knowledge that we have is able to say where not to invest, that's an important message as much as where to go. And that we can leverage that information to reduce risks across different actors. So whether that's at farm level through price information or better training and capacity development, or whether that's reducing risk for private sector, whatever it is, leveraging that information we have to reduce risks. And then also targeting interventions, so using that information to target programs and projects so that we can reach different goals in different contexts. And I think it's also another message was that the private sector does that too. The private sector isn't just entirely about internal rate of return, as much as that might be important, but private sector has different goals as well, and that across those range of actors, we can kind of target what we do. So in terms of those roles of the actors, that was a very difficult question to tackle during our panel on private sector. It was interesting to me that one of the messages that we're hearing is not just strengthening the role of the private sector, but also strengthening the role of the public sector as well. And that there needs to be a really smart role for government, whether that's through policy change or whether that's through how governments invest and where they invest. So for me, a couple of takeaway points, and I know everyone will have different things that they hear today, but for me, some of the issues are around the pathways to scaling, and also the pathways so that so that small-scale irrigation contributes to resilience. So that may be about linkages between economic and environmental sustainability and how to mitigate the risks for natural resources, but how that in turn helps to ensure sustainability of the economic side. Because if you use all the natural resources, you won't have longer-term economic benefit. But finally, also about the issue of inclusivity. We know that this is farmer-led, but we also know that a lot of people are excluded from that. And that in order to reach those goals around livelihood, nutrition and health, and resilience, we have to think about inclusivity and equality. And that there are different modalities to reach that, and that there are different modalities to achieve scale. But as we're looking at what those are, we have to think about that equitability issue so that we're reaching not just those who are already doing it, but we're reaching people who are marginalized, but who could also benefit from small-scale irrigation. So that's how those for me were some of the takeaway messages from the day. It's a tough one to summarize, but those are my takeaway messages. So.
Thank you very much, Nicole. We're coming to the end of the day. If you'll permit the moderator to have a few personal observations as we're coming into the 5th year of this 5-year cooperative agreement and reflecting back on what's been important in making things happen. There are a few overarching things that possibly could be said about this project. One of the things is that is the interdisciplinary nature of the team of people that have been working together. This team had to learn to understand each other, to speak a common language. When they started, they didn't really like to talk to each other. Now they tolerate each other pretty well, and I think with continued experience, they might even get to where they can like each other. No, the team building is not something that you deal with lightly. It's a treasure once you've gotten it started. The team is bigger than the people that you heard today by quite a bit. We have a lot of international partners. We have a lot of national partners. We stand on the shoulders of giants that went before us. For instance, at Bahidar University, we found a very well-developed hydrology department that was pretty sophisticated, because Cornell University, under USAID sponsorship, had been working at Cornell building the institution 10 years before we got there. So when we landed, we already had a tremendous asset there. So the assets that go into interdisciplinary research are precious and treasured, and the ability to communicate across national lines, across interdisciplinary lines, and between institutions, such as the performers and the funders, the donors of these things. All of those linkages are really important to making a complicated project work. Ours is not by any stretch even close to a large project in USAID terms, but it is an interesting interdisciplinary group that have sort of learned to work together. So it's been my really honor and pleasure to be able to watch over this and try to as they say down in Texas, try to herd the cats into a common framework. And I think what you've heard today is the product of how that's gone together. So I'm grateful to all of you for staying. I told you at noon today that getting about 80% of the people back in the room after lunch was an accomplishment. Getting about 70% of them still here at the end of the day is really good. And if I don't quit talking pretty soon, then there'll be a much smaller group, I expect, that's sitting around. When I was working in the state of Texas, I spent a lot of time in the legislature lobbying for our funds, and they used to tell a story about the dean of the Texas Senate, who was doing a filibuster, and he was on and on for ever so long, and he finally stepped out of order, and the president of the Senate ruled him out of order and slammed the gavel down really hard on the table, so hard that the head of the gavel flew off and hit the dean of the Senate right here, and just laid him back in his chair. And the fellow who was doing the filibuster ran down there and said, John, are you okay? And John roused up like this, and he said, hit me again. I can still hear the son of a bitch. So you can hit me again if you'd like. We're all finished for today. Thank you very much for your participation.